Hello class, Mr. Guarino here. In this video, I'm going to go over how to draw rectangles in Adobe Animate. So we're going to create new. HD 1280 by 720, HTML5 canvas, and then create. Okay, so over here we have our rectangle tool. It's a tool slot because it has a little triangle on the bottom. If you click and hold down, you see you get the rectangle tool, the rectangle primitive tool, the oval tool, the oval primitive tool, and the polystar tool. So we're just going to do the regular rectangle tool. And over here, when I have that tool selected, I have fill and stroke. So let's go over that and see what those options are. So when I draw a rectangle, the center section in Animate is called the fill, and the outside is called the stroke. Okay, some people might have called that the border, but in Animate they call it the stroke. If I go back to my selection tool and I click on this one time, I'm only selecting the fill. If I click on, let me click away. If I click on it, double click it, then I select the fill and the stroke. If you only want to select the stroke, you have to click on the stroke. But notice when I click on it, I only get this line. So if I want to get all the stroke, I have to double click the stroke. Or I could click one piece of the stroke and then holding down Shift on my keyboard, click the other three pieces, and then I have all of the stroke. Okay, so let me double click. So now I got both options available because I've selected both. On the fill, if I click that, I can change the color. On the stroke, if I click that, I can change the color. And also I can change the size of the stroke. I can change the way let's see, make this a little bigger. It's a little bigger. And if I double click on this and I say, instead of a rounded joint on the end, which if I zoom in over here, do Control plus a couple times, and then drag this over, you can see that the edge is rounded. If I go to chamfer, then that's like a break, a cut. And if I go to miter, that means just make it a point. These things over here are options too for a rectangle. However, they're really for lines. And you notice it says round cap, projecting cap, and butt cap. And when I change it, you really can't see it because it's the way the lines of the rectangle are ending. But since they're overlapping, you can't tell that these options are doing anything. So let me click away and click on this and delete it. And then you can see if I click on this, and right now it's extended, this is rounded, and this is butt cap. So it's flush with the rectangle, has a radius that goes out from the rectangle, further than the rectangle, and extended is flat, but going past the rectangle. And let me zoom back out. And then draw another rectangle and tell you, you don't have to have a stroke and a fill to start with. You can turn off the stroke. So now there's two ways to turn off the stroke. There's one to just say no stroke at all. So if I come here and I click, that's no stroke. So when I draw it, I get a rectangle without stroke. Now if I go here and I click and I say make the stroke red, well, it's not there. But I can add it back in using this tool, which is the ink bottle tool, but it's not right there. If I click and hold down, the paint bucket tool is usually there by default, but underneath it or in the same slot is the ink bottle tool. So if I click that and I have my stroke set to red and I come here and I click, it adds a red stroke around it. Now if I draw another rectangle, and this time instead of saying no stroke, just turn the alpha down to, down to 0. It's harder to drag. It's hard to drag sometimes. Let me just hit 0. So now when I draw it, there's no stroke again, but actually the stroke is there. It's just invisible. So if I were to go back and double click on this, you can see that the stroke is there. And if I click here and turn up the alpha, let me drag this time so you can see it slowly. I guess because it's selected, it's going to stay green. But after I'm done, if I click away, you can see that the stroke is there. Actually, it looks a little weird. Let's put it at 100. And then click away, and then we got a green stroke because this was set to green, I guess. So there's the difference between not having a stroke and having the stroke invisible. It's not that big of a difference because if you draw it without the stroke, you can always add it back in with the ink bottle tool. If you draw it and it's invisible, you just change the alpha property to make it visible. Also, when you draw a rectangle, you can have the corners rounded with a certain amount. So if I put in here 45 and then draw, you get more of a rounded rectangle. I mean, that doesn't even look like a rectangle. It looks like a little pill, right? So you can do that. You can also change and not have them all be the same. So that when I draw the next rectangle, I get some sharp radius and some bigger radius over here, or maybe it's over here. I guess that's the bottom right. Yeah, so that goes with the 75. But now if I want to change that, if I go to my select tool and I click here, when I double click, I mean, that option's not available. It's only available when you create it. But there is a way to be able to change that after it's created, and that's called the rectangle primitive tool. So with that, you'll notice that I had some numbers previously set up. So if I click and drag, you'll see that it's a radius of 88, 38, 63, and this one's negative 118 because I was playing around with it, as I said. And notice these little green dots. Let me zoom in. So these little green dots are places, we call them anchor points. So the straight line goes from here to here. That's the anchor between the curve and the straight line. And you can actually adjust that manually by clicking, holding down on the selection tool and choosing the sub-selection tool. This one's a little tricky because you get a white arrow, but if you hold over it, you get like a white arrow with a black dot, with a black square. If I click and hold down when I have that, I'm actually moving the item. Okay, if I click when it's just a white triangle, I'm deselecting. But if I get the black, did I say triangle? I meant arrow. When I click, when I get the black arrow, that arrow right there, if I click and hold, like I click and hold down, it's a little jumpy. Then I can, oh, I'm supposed to be able to. Then I can adjust the radius sort of manually instead of putting in numbers. Oh, I could adjust this one. Oh, there it goes. Like I said, it's a little tricky, that tool. So sometimes you click, you're getting the wrong thing, and it doesn't do what you want. Just play around with it a little bit if you actually do want to adjust things like that. And you can also play around with these things as well. So you can see that the corners, instead of being sharp, I can chamfer them, or I can round them. Go back and adjust more. You can get like a really sort of weird looking effect. These are all just things up to you, just techniques you can use to draw stuff in Animate that you can then later animate it. So these are the things you can do. So let me zoom out with the rectangle tool. The rectangle, oops, a little too far. With the rectangle tool and the rectangle primitive tool. So for this assignment, what are you supposed to do? Now that you know how to do the rectangle tool, just play around. Draw me a bunch of rectangles and then save it to your folder.